Zaga, Zen.
From every whisper to every commotion.
That's rubbish. The KSAMC cannot investigate itself.
Was Click News really talking like that?
Every news story unfolds here first at Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. Every sound is a story, and every story we share is news.
Champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans for justice. The people's champion. Justice. Justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice. Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Justice. Justice for all.
Welcome to another episode of Let's Start Justice. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director of JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist at JFJ.
All right. So this week, we're going to be having some discussions on the iron fist of the self-styled, the world's coolest dictator, according to Burkill. That's how he calls himself. Yeah. So we're going to be looking at the fact that Jamaica, we've had state of public emergency since 2018. And where are we going with the El Salvador model that we've been hearing people calling for, romanticizing over, salivating over? We're going to be having that discussion with a researcher from Amnesty International, right?
Yep.
But before we get into it, just very quickly, last week the organization stood with Mercia Fraser, the mother of Mario Deane, killed while in police custody. 10 years later, still no justice. Miss Fraser, brave woman, continues to demand justice for her son. And JFJ, we have been speaking with her. We publicly indicated the challenges that we've been seeing where the state, in our estimation, based on what has unfolded before the court, has not been moving with the type of alacrity that is required so that the matter can progress in a timely manner. I'm seeing where Nationwide carried a coverage of the Minister of Justice, Delroy Chuck, saying that it's scandalous that 10 years later, still nothing from the state, and he's urging the state agencies to move as quickly as they can. And it's not the first time we've heard Delroy Chuck indicating that matters before the court, where it is not the defendant's fault, should not go beyond 5 years. But Minister Chuck, I think it's important as the Justice Minister. Perhaps these are some of the things that we really need to look into. What does a reasonable trial means within our constitution? Much of these things need to be ventilated because 10 years later, it really is an injustice that Miss Fraser has not gotten this matter, heard before the courts. And certainly the defendant's right to a speed trial is also being undermined because while we stand with Miss Fraser, the 3 police officers, they deserve to have their day in court. So much to discuss in coming days around that. Yeah?
Yes, for sure.
All right. Over to you.
Over to me? Okay. All right. So we have our right of the day today, and we took it from Section 16 of the Constitution, Section 16.1, and it speaks to the protection of the right to due process. And it is on theme today as we are talking about El Salvador, where currently there is no right to due process. But I won't preempt our discussion.
Well, there was, but it's been undermined by the state.
Most certainly,
yes.
Right? So under our Constitution, Section 16.1, whenever any person is charged with a criminal offense, unless that charge is withdrawn, they are to be afforded a fair hearing within a reasonable time by an independent and impartial court established by law. Now, there are several other things that go with this that would include your right to be represented by an attorney, the fact that you should be able to have visitation while you are in custody, and many, many, many other things under that Section 16. Yeah. For our trivia question for today, we are asking you what section of the Constitution prevents double jeopardy. We need the exact section and subsection, not the general section. So if you have that answer, you can respond in the YouTube chat on Nationwide or on JFJ's YouTube channel, and you can also respond to 2397583 or on our Instagram page.
All right. So again, we're discussing the matter of what is happening in El Salvador. The fact that we've been hearing calls, we've had our own state of public emergency here in Jamaica, and we're going to be joined by Irene Cuellar, or Cuellar, the researcher at Amnesty. She is experienced in what is happening in El Salvador. But before we get into it, just to provide some context to the listeners. 2018 was not the first time Jamaica had a state of public emergency. We've had in the past, for example, we know about the 1976 state of public emergency that saw two opposition leaders at the time being detained for several months, I believe over a year, for one of them in 1976. We know about the state of emergency that was declared following the Tivoli incursion in 2010.
Yes.
However, since 2018, we have been having routine use of state of public emergency and a bit of a draconian measure to fight crime in our own country. We've heard from the Prime Minister that state of public emergency will always be here as long as the crime rate is high. He's going to be using it, given in his estimation it is constitutional. JFJ, we have actually brought the matter before the courts. That's something else we will delve into in a little while. However, since 2018, following a lot of state of public emergency, what we have heard as well in Jamaica is a promise for the Enhanced Security Measures Act, the ESMA as it is called, but we don't know what exactly entails in that proposed legislation. We can take a guess based on some of the utterances made by the Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness. For example, he mentioned control measures, and if you look within the UK Anti-Terrorism Act, what it means is that the state can say, listen to me, I don't think you should move from here to there, which means your freedom of movement and so on will be restricted. Jamaica, we've also had a revised bail act last year, and it has what you call pre-charge bail, where you can be detained in custody even though you are not yet charged for a crime. All right?
Yes. Now, these measures seem akin to some of those that have already been employed in El Salvador. However, there have been several concerns raised by both international communities and human rights actors about El Salvador's model. So while they would have seen a dramatic reduction in homicides, they would have also seen mass incarcerations, they would have seen prolonged states of emergency, and from several of Amnesty's reports, forced disappearances, and so on. Now, this heavy criticism is due to the constant human rights abuses that have been documented over the period of time. Now, the government would continue to undermine these fundamental human rights, including the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial.
All right, so we're joined by Irene Cuellar. Irene?
Hi guys, how are you?
And we're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to paint a picture for the listeners, because I don't want us to run out of time before the next break, what exactly is Amnesty International doing in terms of the work in El Salvador?
Well, actually right now, since the state of exception in El Salvador had been implemented, Amnesty International has extensively documented the situation, highlighting the deterioration of human rights within the context and the government's failure on adopting a more comprehensive and long-term policies that address the root causes of violence and criminality.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much, Irene. And, you know, in Jamaica here, we do have alarming high crime rates, and our citizens are fearful, and one can understand the fear that they have. But before we even go into some of that, we've heard the Berkelism approach, the Berkel model, so to speak. What exactly is happening in El Salvador so that you can paint that picture for the listeners?
Well, I would say that El Salvador context was pretty similar in the terms of security and criminality. A similar context that some other countries within the region have had. Right now, the current security model in El Salvador is characterized by a highly repressive and punitive approach rooted in the systematic violation of human rights. This model is basically centered around the implementation of the state of emergency, which has led to the suspension of fundamental rights and the enactment of legal reforms that had undermined due process and other human rights protections and guarantees. The government of Nayib Bukele has prioritized these measures as the cornerstone of its security strategy, despite widespread reports of human rights violations, including arbitrary detentions, forced disappearance, and torture. Basically, this model has not only failed to address the issue with a more comprehensive approach that tackles the root causes of insecurity and crime, but it also has replaced gang violence with state violence.
Yes.
It is true that the gang violence has been eliminated, but we have seen a rise in this of state violence. It is important also to point out that this model is also marked by the concentration of power in hands of the executive, coupled with the evasion of any form of accountability or oversight, both from internal actors within the country and from external international bodies.
Yes.
I heard you mention the legal reforms. What exactly was changed, and how would that affect persons being able to take up their rights in El Salvador?
Well, basically, all the due process guarantees have been eliminated. Now people are always thinking that whenever the Congress is not longer promoting the state of exception, the due process guarantees will be again in place, but this is not true because the reforms in all the legislation that has been taken under the last 2 years also prevents the citizens to have a trial with all the due process guarantees.
Thanks so much, Irene. I want to, just a quick explanation for the listeners so they appreciate the importance and the alarming nature of what you're saying. We know that there are 3 branches of government and they're separated for a reason. You want to ensure that you have an independent judiciary. You want to ensure that the powers of the executive is curtailed. You want to ensure that you have a strong legislator so that laws are passed independently and with evidence-based approach rather than with the influence of a single person or a small group. So when the executive is undermined, it means that the concentration of power is in the hands of a limited number of people, and it can also be in the hands of the military, the police, the law enforcement. And if your due process are being undermined, it means that your ability to have your day in court, your ability to have independent monitoring of prison visits and so on, all of those elements have been gotten rid of, so to speak. And that is really something I want to emphasize what Irene spoke of, so that the listeners can get context as you look at Jamaica and really have some critical analysis of what is happening. So Irene, you made mention of due process being undermined. One of the things from our reading that we flagged is that while you do have attorneys being able to pursue some matters in terms of the criminal aspect of things, to have their clients released if it is that they are innocent and so on. I read where the civil remedies have completely been done away with. So, in other words, if the state violates your human rights, the ability to sue them to get some compensation. Are you able to speak on that?
Well, actually, the government has not recognized any abuse or any violations on human rights, not officially.
To begin with.
They have mentioned, to begin with, yeah. They have mentioned a couple of times pseudo margin of error, they have called it. But this margin of error, it's around 10% of the arbitrary detentions that the state of exception has had within the 2 years, within the 2 last years. And these individuals are not, have not been released, found not guilty within the process. They have only been released from jail, but they have been, they are being forced to continue with the process. And this is one of the things that we are really concerned about, because these people are gonna face a trial without any guarantees. We are talking about also about massive trials where 800, 900 people are gonna be processed at the same time. So you wonder which will be the capacity of these individuals to exercise their right to
a fair hearing,
effective defense.
Yeah.
Right.
So Irene, just to clarify, and I'm going to ask you to speak up a little in the mic. Some of the listeners not hearing well, but just to clarify, you're saying that it's not a case wherein it's one gang and therefore the state believes that because the crime is the same, you're going to be prosecuting at once. You're talking about 800, 900 people having one trial at once?
Yes, exactly that. And the proof that the government has on these people that they are members or that could be members of a gang are really, I would say, in some cases, they don't have really evidence. We have read some of the police acts that they are in their files, that the reason that they were taken into jail was because they seemed nervous when the police took them to jail.
Mm-hmm.
So there is not really an investigation behind all these detentions. And it's an interesting thing that the gang leaders that in El Salvador, they call them Ranfla, that were about within 15 members, all in jail.
Mm-hmm.
They all had extraditional. The United States were asking for them to be judged in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And the government, the Supreme Court, decided not to extradite.
Yeah.
So you wonder if the country, if the government says that has this strategy that is based on tackling the the gangs, why not start with the gang leaders?
You know, I, as much as we as human rights actors have also been looking at the situation with some level of alarm, it is these policies seem to become seem to have been very popular, especially in Latin American political spaces. So I guess my question would be, firstly, is anyone else or has any other administration taken up a similar approach, and what have the effects been in their jurisdictions?
Well, such representative measure might be attractive to other governments facing high levels of crime. We have seen attempts of copying the model in Ecuador, for example, and Honduras also. And of course, the fears is that other nations might consider implementing similar policies underestimating the long-term damage to human rights and democratic governance. But this model should not be copied by other countries for several reasons. First and foremost, any successful security model must be rooted in respect for human rights. Even when extraordinary measures like a state of emergency are adopted, the state is also obligated to take extraordinary steps to prevent abuses and human rights violations. Additionally, I would say that the politicians that are including this in their visions and in their political offers, they should consider that the structures and operation of criminal activity differs from country to country.
Yes.
Geographic and socioeconomic conditions vary widely, and these factors must be considered when designing security strategies as well. El Salvador is a really, really small country. I would say it's the smallest or the second smallest country within the region. And you cannot compare the capacity of the gangs in El Salvador with the capacity of the I don't know, like with the narcos here in Mexico. So I would point out that couple of factors, and also that the process of designing a security strategy or model should be carried out in collaboration with local civil society organizations and all the stakeholders within the countries. And this is a thing that in El Salvador we have not seen at all.
You know, thanks, Irene. As I said earlier, the crime rate is high and people want to see decisive action. But as you stated at the start, we're replacing gang violence with state violence. And some of the things that we've seen happening in our country, or that has happened over time. At the start, I also mentioned the 1976 SoE that had 2 opposition members at the time being detained by the government. I'm aware of one such situation in El Salvador. Are you aware of any, Irene, that you can just, again, paint a picture of the listeners who are calling for this in terms of even how the political opposition can be silenced and the emergency powers and the laws are exploited so that you don't have a strong political party contesting what the government is doing?
Well, as I said before, this is a model that is one of its trademark is the concentration of powers in the hands of a very small group, um, coupled with the evasions of any form of accountability of on oversight. But another trademark of this model is the suppression of civic space. The government right now in El Salvador has been targeting human rights defenders, journalists, and all kind of dissidents.
Yes.
And
Irene, just can you hold that thought for me? We have to take the break, but I want to pick up a point around the journalist and freedom of expression. That even to speak about gang violence, we've had journalists being detained by the state. So please just bear with us for another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Unicomer Jamaica presents Better You, a health and wellness initiative designed to empower a healthier workforce. Tune in to Nationwide at 5 from 6 to 8 p.m. on Wednesday, August 28, 2024, as we come to you live from Unicomer's Better You Health Fair and launch. Don't miss all the excitement and highlights as we learn more about how Unicomer invests in the health and well-being of its employees. Health checks, nutrition tips, exercise classes, free medicals for the kids, games, giveaways, and enough prizes. Don't miss Better You, promoting a healthier you to a better you. That's a live broadcast of Nationwide at 5 from 6 to 8 p.m. on August 28, 2024. All this and more only on Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. This broadcast is brought to you by Unicomer.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We are looking at state of public emergency and beyond, and some of the lessons that we are learning from El Salvador. And when I say learning, it's not to adopt, it's to reject it completely. And we're joined by Irene Cuellar from Amnesty International, who's just giving us some context of how those who may not agree with the government have been silenced by the state. Irene, if you could just finish your thought and add to how human rights defenders and the media practitioners have been affected by what's happening in El Salvador. Irene, I think you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. As I was saying, one of the trademarks of this model in El Salvador has been the targeting that the government has been having on human rights defenders and journalists and all dissidents using different strategies, like, for example, implementing vague legal charges to criminalize journalists and fostering an environment of fear and self-censorship as well.
Yes.
Right now in El Salvador, the situation for journalists is extremely precarious, but not only because these strategies that I was mentioning, but also because they have been labeled as political opponents. And also because right now in El Salvador, public information is extremely hard to get. Mm-hmm. I mean, information and the power of the government is being all declared under reserve.
I heard even the names of judges are rescinded now.
I'm sorry, what?
I heard even the names of judges that are overseeing some of these cases.
Yes, of course, they are reserved. And for example, you cannot have an official number of how many men or women or people underage are right now in jail, for example. That basic information.
To even track if children are being criminalized by what's happening.
Yeah, you cannot have any kind, all the information related to security measures have been declared under reserve.
Thanks, Irene. Any last thoughts from you? Because as I stated earlier, and you mentioned it, you have Ecuador and others, and
Honduras.
Honduras and Jamaica here. We're really clamoring for El Salvador. What is your advice to us, based on just your knowledge of Jamaica, but especially your experience with what is happening in El Salvador?
Well, we have extensively documented the situation in El Salvador and Honduras as well, and in Ecuador. From what we have seen, the model is not replicable. I mean, it sounds pretty good in the speeches and in the social media as well, with all the videos, nice videos, and getting the sense from distance that in El Salvador, security has been able to accomplish through 2 years of a state of exception. But what rarely comes out is the other face of this picture, and it's the widespread human rights violations that are occurring. And I think in this context, it's really important that instead of choosing popularity and short versions of possible solutions of long-term problems, we take a look to the deterioration of the human rights and the democratic governance within the country.
Yes.
It's happening really quickly. Behind a veil of popularity that the president has right now, and the ability that his government also had even to replace the traditional international community with YouTubers, for example. I found it really alarming and with curiosity also when I was in an Uber in the States about a year ago, and the driver was from Djibouti.
Yes.
And when we started to have a small talk, I mentioned that I was from El Salvador, and the first thing that he told me in that little chat was Bukele, Bitcoin. And I was like, oh my God. And this is a guy from Djibouti. And he didn't know about El Salvador exactly. He knew about Bukele, our president.
Yes.
And one of the other strategy that he's using, that is Bitcoin. But that's more related to the economics of the country. But for me, it was really alarming. I mean, the whole campaign that he has on social media.
The defender of the poor for economics as well, going against price gouging, for example, these are the
Yes, of
things.
course, of
Yeah.
course. And he's building an economic model that is not for the Salvadorians, I would say. It's more for the people that are from other countries that have this idea of getting rich really quick and
Yes.
really easy, and that they are not or they don't want or they don't believe in paying taxes, for example, and having Bitcoin as a legal tender in El Salvador. That I have to say that no, there are little, very very few Salvadorians that really use it as a legal tender. But for these foreigners, it's also a way to not paying taxes in their countries.
Yeah.
And there is also investigations that the use of this currency are ways for financing criminals as well. So there are all sort of strategies that the government of Nayib Bukele are implementing that are shady and against all legal and fair frameworks.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Irene. We really do appreciate your time. I know you're in a meeting, so we're grateful for you sharing your experience and your knowledge of what is happening in El Salvador.
No, thank you to you for the invitation, for bearing with my English that is kind of rusty, and giving me the opportunity as well to get to know a little bit about Jamaica.
Yes.
I wasn't aware. I am a regional researcher, but with a focus on Central America. So
Yes.
having the chance to having this chat made me realize and do some research about Jamaica. So
Yes.
thank you for that as well.
Thank you so much. That was Irene Krehler, researcher with Amnesty International. Jada, she was speaking. There are so many things I want us to touch on, and news commentators asking us to summarize as well. So, for example, some of the areas around arbitrary detention that happened in El Salvador. Look at what happened in Jamaica. I have to keep quoting elements from the Everton Douglas.
Yeah.
5 petitioners to the government, challenged their unlawful detention under the state of public emergency. A couple years ago, JFJ lent assistance to the matter. Among those 5 men, they were detained without charge for a collective 1,846 days, with one man, Gavin Noble, who was detained for 458 days.
Yes.
You're talking about loss of an independent judiciary. We also experienced that under our same SoE in the past. The Minister of National Security, the executive branch, went to Parliament, pushed through their regulations that gave the Minister of National Security powers to issue detention orders. That's not the powers of a minister, not the powers of a police officer. And in other words, the Minister of National Security said, listen, I suspect you of a crime. I'm going to be detaining you for X number of years. That was what happened under Jamaica SoE.
Even as we look at the El Salvador arbitrary detentions, Amnesty has a good article on their site that speaks to some of the experience, because a lot of people focus on the improvement in the crime rate, and this article was focused on residents of a community that was really affected by gang violence. The gangs were very pervasive in that community, and the subject of the article spoke to how when the crackdown just happened, everybody was happy. They were no longer scared to go outside. They were no longer scared to go to the shop, so on. And within a few months, the fear shifted from the gang to the state, because those men who were on the side of the road with the tattoos were replaced by the soldiers, but they are using the similar arbitrary methods to control. So this person who was interviewed had their brother, who is a school teacher, detained in what would have been a raid for gang members, where it was identified he was not a gang member, but them just take him up anyway. They have not seen him since 2022. This article was written in 2024.
Go up in the truck.
Yeah, and that was it.
We take the break, but there are a few more things that Irene said that I want to pick up on,
Yeah.
and the concerns in the chat we're reading through. But we take the break and then we discuss some more matters.
Outperform, outlast. With top performance. Chakama. Reliable, full stop, not comma. We have the expertise for drilling and demolition. We have the power tools for plumbers and electrician. Pan select tools, 3 parts and 3 repairs. 3 parts, 3 repairs. 2 to 3 years. Hilton, available at Delta Supply, 106 Hagley Park Road. Call us at 876-302-6111-4. Delta Supply, we service what we sell.
All right, so we're back discussing El Salvador. Some of the questions I see news commentator asking, we're all sick and tired of people who break the law, and they should be held to account. But news commentator asks the question, why hold them so long without charging them? That's the exact point, is that the state should ensure that it gets the evidence necessary to detain people so that you can bring them before the courts, so that an independent court system can try them to the fullest extent of the law. But we have seen situations, again, under the SoE. By the way, there's a state of public emergency now in Clarendon. Jade, I checked a day or so on the regulations. Have you gotten a hold of them? Were they released?
I have
you
not,
can just
but I
check for
haven't
me
checked
in
since
the
today,
interim.
so I'll check.
But these are some of the things that I want people to understand. There's SoE out. Are you aware of some of the rights that have been curtailed? We look at it and we say that every person who comes or come in contact with the law, they have due process rights. They're accused of a crime. You want to ensure that the strength of the evidence remain. And that is why, for example, it doesn't make sense that we call on the police to scrape them up. If it is that what is going to happen is that lawsuits are going to be brought against the state, we have to be asking ourselves, what is the cost that we're willing to pay? I think that's the question I want people to understand. I've articulated that some of the things that we must look at, and we can look at the El Salvador model again and look at the history of Jamaica. People are being silenced when they criticize the government. Is that the cost that you're willing to pay in Jamaica? Is the cost that you're willing to pay if your son, your husband, your partner, a family member is suspected of a crime, and without evidence, you can have the state scrape up that person, bring them in custody, and then they're languishing in detention for years without having a trial? Is that the cost we're willing to pay in Jamaica? Is the cost that we're willing to pay in Jamaica that media practitioners can't speak freely, can't criticize the government? Is that the cost that we're willing to pay in Jamaica? Is the cost that we're willing to pay in Jamaica one where we don't have an independent judiciary, where the executive branch of government can take it upon themselves, have how many police officers, security force members out in the communities doing what they want? Is that the cost that we're willing to pay to solve crime? These are the questions I want people to answer while we determine what exactly we want here in Jamaica.
I'm not seeing it.
And you're still not seeing the regulations.
No.
And it's a month long. We're how many weeks in? 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And no regulations so far on the state of public emergency.
I just wanted to point out something about the civic participation in El Salvador, because as we talk about the measures, we have to also acknowledge the trajectory in which the measures are taken. And one of the most recent amendments to their constitution, I think it was section 298 or 296, I can't remember the exact number, but that section would have allowed for civic participation. So when you want to pass an amendment to a bill or a new bill, the citizens would be able to comment on that, as we have in our system here. The state would have, the ruling party would have removed that section out of the constitution and amended it so that only a simple majority would be needed to pass any amendment.
No, but it's two different things. Civic participation from the citizens, that's one issue.
Yeah, sure.
But in terms of using the majority in their Congress to pass laws.
Yes, I'm putting the two together, because also the using the majority to pass the laws prevents them from going through what we would have in our, for example, parliamentary submission process, in which we would look at the proposals and make recommendations.
So you don't want to hear anything from the citizens?
No, you don't want to hear that, and you also don't want to
opposition.
hear from the opposition. And they would have seen several
instances. Which is
instances.
required by law in any legislator.
Right. And they would have seen several instances now where this ruling majority, which is Burkell's majority, have passed several other amendments that would have affected fair trial and civil liberties. And the opposition would have been unable to respond to those things.
Thanks, Jade, for indicating that. Honestly, I want you to listen clearly. There's no one on this program who says that people in Jamaica are being silenced if they criticize the government. We indicated that that is what is happening in El Salvador. So as you listen to the program, I urge us to listen keenly. And then you may not agree with JFJ, you may not like JFJ and its staff, that's fine. We all do have a right to freedom of expression. But I also urge us to think critically what exactly we want in our country. Because today it can be the political party of your choice. But the next time the election comes, you have to ask yourself, would my position still remain if it were the other party in power? Is my view of the 1976 state of public emergency one that says, listen, what kind of law did the government of the day had that would have seen 2 parliamentary opposition members being detained? Is our position a principled one? And there is a question, I wrote an article on JFJ's behalf in the Sunday paper, and a question and view that I posited on the organization behalf is that many of us are saying, crime is high, let's give the executive branch all the power that it needs to go there and deal with people strongly. But I ask you to think on this. How many people do you know would willingly give up the power, return it after such power has been granted? It sounds good. But ask yourself the question, and that is why we're saying to you as well, look at what is happening with our constitutional reform. Because even with the greatest of intention of any government of the day, we have to ensure that the structures of parliament, the powers and the authority of each branch, they remain strong and independent. And that is why even the selection, I won't use the word election now, the selection of that president and the shift in that 2/3 majority, not to make constitutional amendments, but to, for example, approve the extension of a SoE. I want us, let me use the young people words, stay woke on these things. And we will explain it as we go along in coming weeks. Remember, I did say I wanted Professor Hamilton to come and explain some of these things to us.
Yes.
But these are some of the things I want us to look at critically in terms of what type of democracy do we want, because solving crime is something we all need to deal with. We all need to be a part of that process. But I don't think it should come at the expense of hard-fought civil liberties in our country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Jade, off to body-worn cameras, to segue a little bit. Yeah?
Sure.
So, we've been asking for body-worn cameras. A little bit of context to the listeners. If you remember, this became a policy position of the government it was former Minister of National Security Peter Bunting when the PNP was in power at the time, and they got some $45 million from the US. So it's not just civil society get funds from the international donors and countries. It's also the government, more so the government. So at the time, Peter Bunting got some $45 million, and he announced that hundreds of body-worn cameras would have been purchased. I believe, I don't want to misquote. Let me see if I can bring up the document. But whatever the number was that Peter Bunting had announced, what happened was that 160 was actually procured. And then fast forward a few years after, 1 year after, there was a pilot project, 120 more were purchased and so on. In 2022, we heard from the current Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, that the government had deployed 400 body-worn cameras. That was when he was speaking to the House of Representatives during the sectorial debate. 400 body-worn cameras deployed, 1,000 would be procured. Fast forward to 2023, sectorial presentation, Dr. Horace Chang made a similar announcement, 400 body-worn cameras deployed, 1,000 to be procured. I'm not sure if Dr. Chang misspoke or there was a little bit of a double counting, whether or not the deployment that he understands it to be is total 800. I don't know, because there seems to be lack of clarity on how many body-worn cameras have been procured, but from the data that we've gotten here at JFJ, it's less than 400 that were actually deployed. So Dr. Chang needs to clarify, where he made a statement 2022 that 400 were deployed versus 2023 where he said another 400 were deployed, because that is a total. The math's not matching, so to speak. So Dr. Chang would need to make some clarification in that respect. Nevertheless, it's quite unfortunate that years have passed and we've not seen the full rollout of body-worn cameras. And remember, body-worn cameras protect both citizens and the police officers. So when the officers are in the communities, you want that independent account, because we've seen situation, and Indicom, they have articulated this, that they've had instances where there's an accusation that the officer would have abused the civilian and so on, and then when you look at the body-worn cameras in those limited circumstances, it would have upheld the officer's account of what happened. So we need to ensure that we end the excuses. We've heard about defective, defective uniform, can't fit on the uniform, and all manners of excuses. Recently, the police commissioner, Dr. Blake, indicated that he welcomes the body-worn cameras. But listen, another excuse is there. Infrastructure not there. And while, I defer to Dr. Blake, he's way more experienced in this area than I am. But at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, how many more excuses can we take as a country when you're talking about the need for improved police accountability? Because there was no timeline offered by Dr. Blake, and I think that is important. Dr. Blake ought to tell us what is the timeline.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else to add on the body-worn cameras?
Not at this time. I'm sure we'll have something out on the body-worn cameras maybe this afternoon. That will articulate to the fullest extent our position and some of the history of that deployment that we've been looking for.
Just lastly to add here is that one of the things that we look at with the body-worn cameras is the redeployment of where the body-worn cameras are. So, for example, you heard Indicom, Hamish Campbell was on this program a few weeks ago explaining that when it comes to planned operations where you have seen civilians dying in those situations, it's important that you have that independent account of what were the circumstances that led to the death. JFJ, we have articulated that when you have officers deployed in the communities that are under SoE, in the communities where you have low trust levels between the citizens and the police, then it is important that body-worn cameras are deployed in those communities. Because while we appreciate what Dr. Blake has indicated, as Hamish Campbell said, it's not a case where body-worn cameras are not being worn already. The infrastructure may need to be strengthened, but what else is needed? And the last thing I want to touch on before we go, for those who would like to read the JCF policy on the body-worn cameras, I think it's important that we recognize the gaps where it needs to be strengthened to ensure that officers are utilizing the body-worn cameras, are turning them on, and once they breach any provision under the operations and the guidelines, the SOP, they will be sanctioned, and we need to know what those disciplinary actions are. All right?
Yes, our trivia winner was news commentator J.A.
Again.
Yes, the response to the trivia question. The question was, where would we find the section of the Constitution that prevents double jeopardy? Was the same section 16, and it's section 16.8.
Okay.
So news commentator was correct, and someone will reach out to you with your prize.
I think she has taken over from our personal IG.
Yeah, definitely, much faster.
All right, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director.
And I'm Jade Williams.
Jamaicans, by justice, the people's champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Out of many, we are one in a Jamaica. Make it a better place for the boys and girls. Created equal by the creator. For equal rights and opportunities. No to unlawful detention and police brutalization. Class, gender, race or religion. We not tolerate discrimination.
To join the fight against injustice, contact us at 755-4524 or JamaicансForJustice.org.
The people's champion. JP said Mary's banana chips. 20% more chips in the banana left on ground. The time by JP said Mary's banana chips is
2:00.
The government of Jamaica has purchased brand new state-of-the-art buses to further enhance commuter experience,